Which brings us to today's session and to our speaker today. Michael's been here before. He gave a talk on the Roman villa at Piazza Armerina, which I hope I'll be able to see in September this year when I'm proposing to be in Sicily. And he gave in the same session a talk on Rome and Jerusalem. For those of you who were here before, you'll already know who we're talking about, but some of you are new to the group, so I'll just remind you that Michael studied archaeology at the University of Sydney in the mid-1980s. He went on to Macquarie University to do an MA and then a PhD. He's worked very extensively in Egypt and in Israel on a number of archaeological sites. From 1987 to 2002, he was a tutor, 1987 to 2002 is the archaeological project. From 1992 to 2002, he was a tutor and lecturer at Macquarie University. He currently runs a travel company called BC Archaeology, which will be well known to a number of you in the audience, specialising in tours to the ancient Mediterranean. And I believe there's 5 of you, or up to 5 of you in the audience today, are about to join him on his most recent tours to Egypt. He's setting off there on Tuesday, and the group are all joining him on Saturday, I think it is, for a tour of ancient Egypt. Today, he's going to be talking to us about 2 topics from parts of the Roman Empire that we don't often hear about. Unfortunately, because of where we are in Australia, you very often have to make do with me, and that means talking about Roman Britain or Jordan or Syria. I've never been to Egypt, and I've seldom been to Spain, so we sort of lack people who can talk about those things. So we're very fortunate today that Michael's going to talk to us about the Roman city of Merida in Spain, and then he's going to talk after the break about the library at Alexandria. We will have a break for the usual half hour. Michael will probably talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have our break outside, and then return to hear his second lecture, with the inevitable raffle in between. I brought some magazines in. I don't know what's happened to them all. I'm having a grand clean out in my room since I have to anticipate retirement and losing at least some of the space I've got in the university. So I've been throwing out lots of things, including about 5,000 slides during the week, for which there are no longer any projectors in the university. But I've found lots of magazines I brought in today. If anybody wants them, just help yourself. They seem to be doing the rounds, but they're for taking away if you'd like them. Michael, can I introduce Michael Birrell, who's now going to talk to us about Merida in Spain, and I will hand him the keys of the kingdom, namely the pointer.
The pointer.
There it is.
Thank you.
And I think you probably know how to swap over. Oops.
Can you hear me? All right. David, there's your USB to remember. All right. So, welcome everybody to RAG, and to David, thank you very much for inviting me to come over to Perth to give another lecture. Very happy to do so. It's very pleasant to be here. And to Nora Cooper, thank you so much, and her husband Roger, thank you for looking after me. It's much appreciated. I'm talking about the Roman side of Merida today. I've been there many times. It's a spectacular Roman settlement, one of the best preserved really in Western Europe. And I heard a few gasps when I put this slide up. It has really one of the best preserved Roman theatres in Western Europe. It's a nice example of a colonial provincial capital. Merida, as we'll see, was the provincial capital of Lusitania province in southwest Iberian Peninsula, and it preserves a good range of infrastructure, Roman buildings, that reflects the type of urban settlements that you find throughout the Roman world, but which are not always so well preserved in Europe, where large cities have often been built over the top of the old Roman settlements. In this case, we're quite lucky that from the medieval period onwards, Merida was not densely populated. No large settlement grew up on the site, and as a result, it's been possible since the early 20th century to excavate extensively at the site and to really have ongoing extensive excavations by the Spanish authorities to clear large civic monuments in a way that you just don't have the opportunity to do elsewhere in Europe. In Rome, for instance, you just have bits and pieces excavated. So Merida, on your map, on your handout there, Merida is located there. It's on the Ana River. The Ana River flows down out of central Spain, down into the Atlantic, the Gulf of Cadiz. In Arabic, it was the Wadi Ana, the Ana Valley, the Ana River, and today it's called the Guadiana in Spanish. Certainly, the river was everything for the settlement. This model, which is in the Merida Museum, gives you an impression of what the settlement originally looked like. It was not a large city by any means, but it did have a broad range of civic facilities, which places it high in status. The fact that incorporated within the city there was an amphitheater for gladiatorial combat, a theatre, a civic forum with temples, and just off the model, a circus, indicates that it certainly functioned as a major urban centre. Now, as I put there in the yellow text, Merida was founded as a retirement village, is the best way to think of it. It was a colony established by the Roman authorities under Augustus as a settlement for colonists who were being retired from the Roman army. And it was established by who would become the Emperor Augustus, Octavian, in 25 BC as part of his settlement of legionary troops. So we have to imagine quite a rowdy, uncultured bunch being imposed on this place. We know from the archaeological remains that there was already a settlement here, and that's not unsurprising because, as the model shows, the river Ana has many islands in it, and it was a convenient and good place for fording that major river. So there's always been a settlement even before the Roman period. The original settlers before the Romans were the Vettoni people of the broader region of Lusitania. And at this period in 25 BC, that part of southwest Iberian Peninsula had only recently been incorporated into the Roman Empire after much fighting and troubles in the 1st century BC. And we get the impression that this settlement, Augusta Emerita, which was established here, was designed by Augustus to be a keeper of the peace. He wanted ex-army soldiers here positioned at this specific place to keep an eye on the rowdy Lusitanians who were on the other side of the river and who had fought long and hard against Roman incorporation. So we have to think of it as a rowdy, very provincial little settlement designed to secure recently conquered territories, really, in the southwest. The settlers who came to settle in Merida, as it's called today, came from two legions, the 5th and the 10th legion. So Legio 5 Laude and Legio 10 Gemina. Both those legions had been established by Julius Caesar and had long been involved in the conquest of Gaul. And by the time that Augustus had reconstituted those two legions, they'd already been in existence for some decades. They'd fought at the Battle of Pharsalus against Pompey the Great, so they had vast experience and vast history, and those two legions would continue to go on into the 2nd and 3rd century AD as very important Roman legions. So the legionaries who are being retired are experienced soldiers who've probably had 20 years of combat experience in very difficult situations. They'd been involved in the civil wars, and this was their payoff. They were to be settled in Lusitania. They were to be given agricultural land, which was taken from the Vitones people in the region, and they established an urban center there at a settlement called Emerita Augusta, or Augusta Emerita, it's also called. Emerita means more or less along the lines that David is heading to emeritus status. That's what it's a reference to. These are emeritus soldiers that are worthy of praise, and their settlement is sort of designed to imply this status. The Romans had long conquered the eastern part of Spain, going back to the Punic Wars, when they'd been fighting against the Carthaginians. So already this territory of Spain, Hispania Citerior and Ulteria Baetica, were long settled, with Corduba, the best-known settlement in the southern part of the central conquested territories. This region only recently conquered, as I said, and Emerita Augusta, the new provincial capital for that area. Augustus had been fighting the Cantabrian Wars, a very long and hard-fought battle that took 10 years to suppress the Asturian and Cantabri tribes of the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula. It took many legions to suppress and incorporate those rowdy Iberian peoples. But by 19 BC, Augustus could claim that he had conquered all of Spain, and Spain was now incorporated firmly into the Roman Empire. Certainly, I've traveled many times over the Cantabrian Mountains. It's a spectacular, rugged country, and the Cantabri were fighting guerrilla warfare against the Roman legions, and the Roman legionaries found it virtually impossible to deal with that. So that's why it took 10 years for the empire to really incorporate the Cantabri into their new empire. By the time of Augustus's reign, Spain was divided up in this pattern. The major part of Spain, the northeast, was Hispania Tarraconensis, ruled from Tarraco. And Emerita Augusta came to control Lusitania, which is mainly Portugal today, although the settlements in Spain, what we call Spain today. The most important aspect of the settlement, and it's an aspect that continues right through into the medieval period, was the control of the bridge and the crossing of the river. And one of the first projects of the Roman legionary troops who arrived at Merida was to build a bridge across the Arno River and to build aqueducts to bring good quality fresh water from springs into the settlement. So they are amongst the first things that the Romans did. And it's quite a broad floodplain. The bridge that the Romans built is over 800 meters long. It's one of the longest Roman bridges of its type. It lay on, as I'll show you, a major trade routes that ran north-south in this part of the world, particularly up into this part of the world, where there were important gold mining facilities that the Romans wanted to keep control of. So the bridge over the Arno was a strategic facility to control the crossing of the bridge, make it easy for troops to cross, and for trade as well, and heading up north and south. As you walk around ancient Merida, you'll find there are many instances where the old Roman roads still are preserved. And just on the eastern side of the bridge, there's quite a good area where the Roman roads are preserved. So those roads required the laying down of multiple layers of stone to produce a good hard surface. The original walls of Roman Merida do not survive, but we know that this was a walled settlement. Archaeology has uncovered large sections of it. And that's why the model that I showed you shows it to be a walled settlement. That was a little bit unusual for the late 1st century BC, for the Romans to be building walled settlements within the empire. And there's a good reason why it was walled from the very beginning. You have the rowdy Vettoni tribes in the area. The local settlers wanted to feel secure. And today when you walk into the later Muslim 9th century fortress here, inside the fortress is preserved part of the line of the ancient Roman wall, much repaired, fixed up over centuries. And what we see here is the 4th century resurfacing of the old walls of Merida running along the river here. So the bridge, much repaired over the centuries. We know that the bridge, which was begun with the foundation of the settlement in 25 BC, we know that it, from inscriptional and physical evidence, that it was still operating, but needed to be repaired in the Visigothic period. So quite incredible that this bridge was still functioning really 500 years after its construction. And the Visigothic authorities restored the bridge, brought it back up to working order, and then subsequently it was repaired repeatedly by the Islamic rulers of Merida up to the present day. And you can still walk across it. A couple of years ago we were there, and some school children said they were all dressed up as Visigoths, and they said we weren't allowed to go across unless we paid a toll. They were collecting money for the school, which was kind of cute. The old Vettoni settlement, the native Hispanic settlement, was replaced by a much more traditional Roman gridiron plan, with villas laid out in rectangular plots with a north, south, east, west grid plan. The forum in the center, which I'll talk about in a second, taking up one of the city blocks as an open area for market traders. And this is the plan that I gave you on the back of the handout, if you are interested to have a look at, as I'm talking about certain elements of the settlement. Of the original settlement, the main roads, the Cardo, the north-south road, ran here, ran out the southern gate through what we presume to be the Capitolium, out through the north gate, the main Decumanus Maximus, the main east-west road, ran out through this gate across the Arno River. So that bridge was part of the layout of the urban landscape. That main north-south road was the road that led up to Astorga, to the main gold-producing area in northern Spain. It crossed a river, so there's a second Roman bridge at Merida. Very impressive to have two Roman bridges still preserved and still capable of taking traffic. That's the smaller of the Roman bridges. In medieval times, the settlement of Merida was occupied by houses, but it's been possible to expose quite large areas of housing. The best preserved area of housing is this section within the Muslim fortress. And you can see typical Roman roads, the houses laid out on a rectangular grid plan, quite fancy ones, and we'll see a few examples of house mosaics in a moment. The settlement required a number of aqueducts to bring fresh water into the centre of the town. Although the river was close by, it was muddy, and it was much better to bring fresh water from local springs. One of the most spectacular of these aqueducts really stands out is Los Milagros Aqueduct. It got that name in medieval times because the people of medieval times could not work out how it would be possible to build such a thing. It had to be a miracle, so it's called the Miraculous Aqueduct. Its largest section is 800 meters, where it crosses the Albarragás River, this little stream here. And the pipe that originally ran across the top of the aqueduct brought fresh water into the center. It led into settling ponds at the northern part of the town and then was distributed by pipes to the houses. So all of that, so that's the aqueduct at the top there. Los Milagros. It's about 800 meters that it crosses the Albarragás Valley. All of these public facilities were within the ambit really of the Roman army engineers. So they would have laid out these aqueducts and started laying the pipes to the houses. So this is quite an early establishment as well, probably around 15 BC, it's believed, the construction of this aqueduct. Quite an interesting method that they've used. Really what they've done is created upright pillars for the aqueduct and held them together with brick arches as a kind of support network. There's a few aqueducts bringing water in. Today, a favoured place for storks to build their nests. The main interest, one can say, for entertainment, undoubtedly for these legionary troops who are being retired, was the amphitheatre. And so from the very earliest days, an entertainment quarter was being established in the southeast quarter of Merida because that's what the local population were really involved with. They've incorporated it within the walls of the city, which is a little bit unusual. Some of the housing, to get back to the houses, they're mainly Mediterranean-style courtyard houses with a light source, an air source coming from an open courtyard surrounded by rooms. Quite good preservation in some parts of the city. And some of the mosaics in the local museum of Merida, quite spectacular. And considering the interests and background of the colonists, much of the subject matter is hunting. That's the sort of thing they're interested in. So the local Roman citizens are going to go out hunting for entertainment. They're going to go to the amphitheatre, and they're interested in horse racing as well. So these are some of the house mosaics. The forum was largely of plaster facing over rubble structure. It was quite impressive, and part of it's been exposed and excavated and restored. And in the local Merida Museum, some of the original stone elements survive, including these discs of Medusa, which originally decorated the arcades. I don't think my local Westfields is as grand as that. This is the market square of Merida, where local traders are going to be setting up their stalls, where they're going to be selling their local produce, etc. Very grand. And the implication is certainly that the local citizens are trying to make a statement that they're cultured, that they're civilized, to have such grand civic complexes with a lot of sculptural material. So a lot of artisans and craftsmen have been employed to decorate the market square. Quite impressive for its scale. Incorporated into that forum was a temple. It's remarkably well preserved. The name that it's known by today is the Temple of Diana, but that's a misnomer from the 17th century. It's much more likely from the physical and inscriptional evidence that it was actually dedicated to the divine genius of Augustus, for whom sculptural material has been found at the site. Very well preserved because a local count built his grand villa in the ruins of the temple, and I wouldn't mind having a Roman temple as my porch, I must say. So the local authorities have been able to buy out the Count's family, and they've been able to restore the temple facade. So we can see the pronaos there, the porch of the temple. A little bit unusual in that it is entirely peripteral. Instead of being Roman style with just a colonnaded facade, they've gone for something much more grand, and to some extent they're looking east to Greece for the architectural inspiration for this, to colonnade the temple all around. So they're spending money, they've got money, and they're spending it big time on grand things. You have to imagine a staircase at the front leading up to the temple. So, yeah, a little unusual in Western Europe to have a peripteral temple like this and such a grand courtyard. It was in an enclosure with pools fed by water. Number 4 were 2 pools. So a really opulent use of sculptural material. And the architectural remains from the archaeological remains that have been found associated with the temple certainly imply the imperial cult was part of what was going on here. So some Julio-Claudian heads have been found. This is a head, of course, of Augustus. There have also been found in the area genii. This little bronze has been interpreted as a genius figure. And this figure, very Antinous-like, has been interpreted as the genius of the settlement, that the settlement itself had a divine essence that was worshipped here in addition to the worship of Augustus. It's in the local museum. Of Of the other main civic space, only a portion's been exposed today, but it's fronted by this impressive arch. The main structural arch survives. It's quite interesting in that you get an impression of how much the landscape has risen over the centuries. You can see from the road there that the physical remains of the settlement have gone up maybe 1.5 meters, something like that. But it's been possible here to excavate the arch out, and you have the original pavement through which people would have walked through this arch here into this civic space. Of interest for historians and archaeologists is the theatre, which was established during the consulship of Marcus Agrippa in the period of the Emperor Augustus, around year 15 BC, when he is tribune, or has tribunician power. His name is associated with the foundation of this theatre, and Agrippa was in Spain fighting with Augustus as part of the Cantabrian Wars, and undoubtedly Agrippa came to Merida and was personally involved in the foundation of the colony for his soldiers, and the inscription commemorates that involvement. It's a very nice theatre, I must say, certainly giving grand sort of social venue for the city. As you can see, it had a 2-story Cine France, very richly decorated with sculpture. So we're not talking provincial, very simple theatre backdrop. We're talking big investment, a lot of sculptural material to decorate it. The inscription commemorating Marcus Agrippa appears twice in the theatre there. So that's the same inscription. If you've been to Rome, you might recognize that inscription from the Pantheon. Consul for the 3rd time. Very lavish use of expensive stone that has been brought in to decorate the facade. It was originally all marble lined. What's interesting about the whole site of Merida, is that it fell down, it gradually collapsed, it was abandoned. Parts of it were reused, but because Merida lies in a place where no significant Renaissance or late medieval settlement existed, much of the material was left in the ground. So all these columns survive. In other parts of the Roman world, where the settlements were developing, all that material would have been robbed out long ago. But it was possible to come to the theatre in the early 20th century and to find most of the Cine France preserved intact, which is quite impressive. It could sit about 6,000 people. That's a modest size theatre. And we should not really think of the theatre as an elite, la-di-da, highfalutin kind of place. It's not the equivalent of going to the opera house, for instance. It's much more the equivalent of going to see a bawdy, lowbrow theatrical production. Vaudeville, it would be the nearest parallel. So the citizens of Merida were not sophisticated, urban, literate people, but like in other parts of the Roman world, they went to the theatre regularly to be entertained by lowbrow, crude, rude, naughty political commentary, of which Trump would make a perfect target, I would have thought. You went to the theatre regularly, and you paid very little to go to the theatre, and what you saw was mime. So you saw largely people, stock characters performing a new story. So it's a little bit like soap opera. You would be going to see characters that you were familiar with, but in a new story. And that story might be politically pointed and be making fun of the local town mayor's wife, for instance, what she'd been doing in the previous week or so. So it would be political slapstick that the theatre would be catering largely to, not highbrow classical Aeschylus and that sort of theatre. Rich decoration, some of the sculpture, amazingly that the sculpture survives, and it's in the museum. At least 7 statues survive, which are in the local museum, which decorated the facade of the theatre. That was probably, it's been identified as Serapis. It wasn't just a theatre, it was also a garden, a peristyle garden, where the citizens could mingle, chat, and talk before going into the theatre. And the local authorities have done a really beautiful job of recreating the look and feel of the theatre garden. It was pretty basic, mainly brick with some stone elements. And inside the theatre garden, there was a shrine to Augustus at the back, down there. He was the patron of the settlement, of course. The settlement is Augusta Emerita. So they've really recreated that look of the theatre. Being rowdy, battle-hardened soldiers, the main source of entertainment undoubtedly would have been the amphitheatre. And they built an impressive one. Some of it's been robbed away. The 2 upper parts of the cavea have been robbed away. But it's an impressive venue for gladiatorial combat. It's ovoid. It has a sunken fossa bestiarum, the fossa where wild beasts would have been kept in the basement before being brought up into the arena. Not just a simple, crude affair, but actually richly decorated. The edges of the amphitheatre were plastered and frescoed with battle scenes in a very sophisticated way. There's the fossa bestiarum where the animals were originally kept. Some of those fragments of those frescoes are today preserved in the Merida Museum, and they show scenes of the sort of activity that's taking place in the arena. Most of these provincial arenas would not have placed so much emphasis on gladiators fighting other gladiators. They were much more interested in seeing gladiators fighting animals. And that's what's represented in the surviving parts of the fresco from the amphitheatre. You see beast fights. They're interested in, the local inhabitants are interested in seeing the skill of the local gladiators, what they can do up against a wild cat, that sort of thing. Wild boar there. Hunting was big in the community, definitely. So it's a nice venue. The fighters would have processed down through the main, it's called the vulva there, the entrance to the amphitheatre. And of course, the modern bullfighting ring is the direct descendant of that kind of arena. I've had the lucky chance to see some bullfights in Seville, and quite remarkable just to see that happening and to hark back to that Roman origins of the bullfight. Quite incredible. In addition to the amphitheatre as a venue for gladiatorial combat, Merida remarkably had a full-sized circus, almost as big as the Circus Maximus in Rome. Quite remarkable. It's over 400 metres long. It's massive. 100 metres wide, and it's thought that it was capable of seating 30,000. So undoubtedly, Merida drew in people for the horse races. Like the theatre, the horse races was something that you attended frequently as entertainment. They were mainly, so there's on the model, there's the circus there. And there on your plan. It's something you went to frequently. It was popular entertainment. You mainly went to see quadriga racing, 4 horses drawing 1 chariot. You'd be watching those horse competitions with interest. You'd be betting on them. Many of the provincial circuses employed professional horse riders, charioteers, who were brought in from outside the settlement because of their skill. There was a lot of money and interest in the sport. So a lot of the concrete underpinning of the seating still survives. To show us the race. Usually the race took 7 laps of the spina in an anti-clockwise direction, and the winner would cross at the end of the spina just here to decide the victor. A lot of money involved, a lot of very wealthy charioteers. Some of the mosaics that survive from Merida, like this one, obviously the owner had a particular interest or may even have owned this quadriga, has represented a particular victory, and you see the charioteer with victory palms and his 4 horses looking rather happy with themselves too. They've been victorious. This is a late Roman mosaic. As we pass into the 4th century, there's increasing pressure from the Christian authorities, particularly in Spain in general, that horse racing is immoral, unchristian, and is to be abolished. But there's plenty of evidence from Merida to indicate that the local people took no interest in those directions coming from the church, and that's proved by a number of restoration inscriptions like this one from the local museum, which show that horse racing continued right through until the 7th century at Merida. Quite incredible. They're still racing at such a late date. This stone commemorates the restoration of the stela of the circus in the time of Constantine II. And that's the inscription that we just saw. Most illustrious man and worthy companion ordered the circus, ruined by old age, to be rebuilt with new columns, surrounded by water, and thus continued by Julius Saturninus, the most worthy governor of the province of Lusitania. Its appearance wisely reconstructed to bestow on the colony of Emerita the greatest conceivable happiness was to go to the races. And as I said, many mosaics from Merida show horse racing as a subject. It's obviously something that the local population took a great deal of interest. In this case, the guy's falling out of his chariot, very Ben-Hur-esque. Christianity arrives at Merida quite early, and traditionally Saint Eulalia was martyred in Merida a young girl killed by Roman legionaries. She was actually tied to that stake and burnt at the stake, and she collapsed and fell onto the ground. And a miraculous fall of snow covered her to guard her innocence and purity. So the story goes. So Saint Eulalia, the patron saint of the town, this supposed martyrdom is taking place under the reign of the Christian persecutions under the Roman Emperor Decius in 250 BC. So Saint Eulalia has many places of worship in the town, and many inscriptions refer to Saint Eulalia in the late 3rd, certainly through the 4th century. So we have this as an example in the museum. Lie quietly in thy own house, Martyr Eulalia, so that when he realizes this circumstance, the enemy will flee in confusion, and so that, as is thy wish, the house and all who dwell within will flourish. Amen. So this is quite a late inscription, 7th century, during the Visigothic period. Many Christian graves preserved as well indicate strong presence of Christians. Spain was broken up into different provincial groupings under Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century, and by 400, Merida, still an important provincial capital controlling Lusitania. Much of the facilities of the settlement had largely been abandoned, and someone built their house in the theatre, in the ruins of the theatre. So by this period, the Christian authorities had said, theatre is immoral, you must not go to the theatre, it's naughty. And clearly by this point, the theatre has been abandoned, it's being filled up with rubbish, and someone even builds their house in the garden of the theatre. It's quite a nice house, and it preserves some of the original frescoes from the dining hall, the triclinium, and the mosaic floors of this Christian era house, in the ruins of the theatre. A contemporary house has been recreated in the Roman Museum in Merida. This is another 4th century house, very beautiful establishment, mosaic floors, fresco walls, remarkably well preserved. So Merida was still a very important, rich settlement in 400 into the 5th century. However, we should take into consideration that in the 5th century we have the Visigothic invasions, and they were part of a broader incursion of barbarians coming across the Rhine. In this case, the Visigoths had crossed the Danube, sacked Athens, sacked Rome, and came into Spain to confront and expel the Suebi, Alans, and Vandals that had arrived before them, and took control of the Iberian Peninsula in the mid to late 5th century. So for quite a long time, under the Visigothic rule, the Visigoths were based in Toledo, in the center of the peninsula. Emerita was retained as an important provincial centre, still the administrative centre of Lusitania. The old Roman houses in Merida, however, were far too grand for the local population. And when archaeologists came to excavate these houses, what they found was that people had moved into the old Roman settlement houses and had divided them up into as many as 8 little apartments because nobody wanted or could afford to maintain a large villa anymore. So in the Visigothic period, we have to think more of a much more simple run-down, more densely populated kind of settlement by that period. Quite good preservation of material from that era. Lastly, I just want to say lots of good evidence from the Muslim invasion of 711. The Berbers crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar in 711, and Merida was taken in 713, so very soon after the Moors crossed into Spain. One of the first things they did was, or shortly after the settlement, was the creation of a new fortress to guard the crossing of the river. The river was still its very important strategic point, and the local Muslim authorities wanted to guard that crossing of the river, so they built a significant fortress there, which restricted access to the crossing and provided security for the governor and his garrison. And today, the Islamic Fortress, very well preserved. There's a copy of the original inscription above the gate there, which identifies this taking place during the reign of Abdel Rahman II, the Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba. Still there. That's what the Islamic Fortress looks like. A garrison was camped in there to control the settlement. And you'll notice that tower there. It's quite an interesting building. It's a secure water source for the garrison. They actually dug a tunnel down through the rock, not down into the river per se, but down to the water table, so that water could come up through the subsurface water, and the garrison had a secure water source which came into this well. I hope you'll agree that Merida preserves us a fascinating insight into a long history from its foundation, 25 BC, down to the Islamic conquest in 713. Thank you very much.